Let me tell you something about the Zoning Board of Appeals for this town. They're basically the fun police, but with clipboards and a scary amount of power over where you can keep your garden gnome. I'm not saying they're evil, but they definitely measure your soul with a ruler and hate anything that brings genuine utility into a backyard. I know this because they, and I quote, categorically denied my application for a 12-foot utility shed. A shed. For rakes. Rakes, people. They said it was non-conforming to the historical sightlines of the neighborhood. Historical sightlines? I live next to a Pizza Hut. The most historically significant thing around here is the grease stain on my driveway from 2018. So yeah, I was mad. I was so mad my teeth were buzzing. I walked into my backyard, the future site of my rake's new home, and just stared at the perfectly green grass. And that's when it hit me, right there between the dandelions and my rapidly developing aneurysm. If I can't build on the land, I thought, then I'll just disappear into it. Forget a shed. I was going to dig a hole so big, so absurd, so utterly and irrevocably non-conforming that the entire zoning board would have to move to a different dimension to avoid the paperwork. I didn't want a bunker. I just wanted justice. And maybe, just maybe, a temperature-controlled storage space big enough to hold 2,000 square feet of glorious, defiant spite. My name is Mitch, by the way, and like most Americans, I have entirely too much stuff that needs to be outside but shielded from the elements. A push mower, a wheelbarrow that keeps mysteriously sprouting rust, those plastic bins full of Christmas lights that never actually get organized. You know the drill. My garage was full of actual useful things, like my gaming rig and a slightly leaky mini-fridge. The shed was supposed to be the solution, the suburban dream realized. It was going to be a nice, pressure-treated, slightly too expensive little house for my tools. I spent a whole Saturday filling out the forms. Seriously, I had to detail the anticipated color temperature of the proposed interior lighting, like I was building the next Louvre instead of a plywood box. I even had to provide elevation drawings. I felt like I was applying to launch a low-orbit satellite, not store fertilizer. Then came the letter. It wasn't a nice letter. It was a dense, beige packet of defeat, signed by some guy named Bartholomew P. Higgins III. Bartholomew had decided that my humble little structure would detract from the established character of the subdivision. That's code for, "We don't like your kind of shed, Mitch." The real kicker was the attached bylaw, highlighted in a sickly yellow. Any detached accessory structure exceeding 100 cubic feet must maintain a minimum setback of 20 feet from all property lines. My backyard is roughly 30 feet wide. My house is huge, which is why I have so many tools, but the yard is where they got me. The perfect spot for the shed was 11 feet from the fence. I didn't have 20, I had 11. Fine, I muttered, crumpling the rejection notice. You want setback? I'll give you setback. I looked at the spot again. I couldn't move the house. I couldn't move the fence. Bartholomew probably had a whole team dedicated to fence height, but they had nothing on the depth of the earth. I'm pretty sure the zoning board map only went to the topsoil layer. They were strictly two-dimensional thinkers. My idea, in its beautiful catastrophic simplicity, was about to introduce them to the third dimension. I was going to dig a hole so deep the mole people would start charging me rent. I just needed a shovel, an overwhelming sense of spite, and maybe a helmet. The next morning, I was outside before the sun had even decided if it was worth the effort. I had procured the most inappropriate tool for the job. A small, shiny garden trowel. It looked like something you'd use to delicately repot a succulent, not breach the Earth's crust. But it was about symbolism, okay? I was starting small, a metaphorical middle finger to Bartholomew P. Higgins III. I spent approximately 37 minutes digging before the reality of cubic yards hit me like a bag of wet cement. I had moved maybe a wheelbarrow's worth of dirt, and I was already sweating profusely and questioning my life choices. The hole was perhaps 3 feet deep and shaped suspiciously like a poorly rendered kidney bean. This wasn't a bunker. This was a future sprained ankle. I wiped my brow, dramatically leaning on the little trowel, which felt more like a crutch now. That's when I heard it. A gentle tisk-tisk-tisk sound, like an air brake on a small bus. I looked up and saw Mrs. Eleanor Henderson peering over the fence. Mrs. Henderson is the neighborhood's self-appointed czar of propriety. She keeps a detailed log of when people take their trash cans in. She wore a pristine white gardening visor and a look of deep, abiding suspicion. "Mitch," she called, her voice brittle enough to shatter glass. "What in the good Lord's name are you doing now? Is that a water feature?" I straightened up, adopting my most earnest, scientific-sounding tone. "Ah, Eleanor, glad you asked. No, this isn't a water feature. This is actually part of my new deep soil composting initiative. It's highly experimental, you see. We're working with anaerobic decomposition at extreme hydrostatic pressure." I threw in a random buzzword. "It's very hydroponic." She squinted. "It looks like you're digging a grave." "Only for poor soil density, Eleanor. Only for poor soil density," I replied, nodding gravely. "I need this hole, eventually, to be about 25 feet deep to reach the optimal geological strata for the fungal agents." I paused for effect. "It's a long-term sustainability project." She just stood there, jaw slightly agape. She didn't understand a word, which was the entire point. "Well, don't let any of that hydroponic dirt spill onto my prized dwarf azaleas, Mitch. They are very sensitive." With that dire warning, she retreated, her mission to gather intel on my activities complete. I knew that conversation was already in the neighborhood group chat, likely captioned, "Mitch is burying something. Send help." But the interaction was a turning point. It solidified my commitment. I couldn't just fill the hole now. That would be admitting defeat to both Bartholomew and Eleanor. I had to go bigger. Deeper. My original shed plan had been 120 square feet. This hole, the one that was going to serve as my monument to spite, needed to be significant. I paced out the entire usable area of my backyard. It was about 40-50 feet. I mentally carved out a 5-foot buffer around the perimeter. That left me with a 30x40 area, 1,200 square feet. But since I was going underground, why stop at one level? Why not a spiral staircase? Why not a cinema room? Why not a dedicated space for my rakes that was larger than my entire kitchen? Before I knew it, 1,200 square feet had morphed into 2,000 square feet across 2 sub-levels, complete with reinforced concrete walls and an independent air filtration system. This wasn't a shed replacement. This was a man cave of geological significance, an absolute, non-conforming, subterranean sanctuary. I slapped the trowel down and pulled out my phone. This was definitely a job for someone who knew how to operate heavy machinery and, crucially, look the other way when asked too many questions. I needed a professional. I needed a conspirator. I typed into Google, "Excavation contractors, no questions asked, competitive rates, possibly ex-military." The first guy I called sounded like he was running his business out of a rusted pickup truck. He listened to my vague request about needing a large hole for a future artistic installation, paused, and said, "Look, buddy, if it ain't got pipes going in or a body going out, I'm not interested." Click. Not my guy. Then I found Gus. Gus ran Gus's Subterranean Solutions, which sounded shady enough. He showed up in a battered Ford F-350 that looked like it had survived the actual apocalypse. Gus himself was a mountain of a man, perpetually smelling of diesel and existential resignation. He wore a high-vis vest over a tattered Nirvana t-shirt. He didn't shake my hand. He just grunted. "So, the hole," Gus said, his voice gravelly. "Where and how deep?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I needed to sound both authoritative and utterly unhinged. "It's going here," I said, pointing to the spot where my kidney bean-shaped trowel hole was. "I need it 25 feet deep, 2,000 square feet footprint. Perimeter support, maybe a ramp for ingress and egress, temporary at first. What's your professional assessment of geological stability?" Gus stared at my house, then at my yard, then back at me. His expression didn't change. He looked like he was cataloging my inevitable mistakes. "That's a basement, kid. A big one." No, I corrected him quickly. "It's not a basement. It's a personal disaster preparedness training facility." "Right. A basement. You got blueprints?" "Blueprints are conceptual," I admitted. "They are currently residing in my head. We're working with a highly flexible design mandate. Think of it as organic excavation." Gus finally cracked a smile, but it was the kind of smile a shark gives a tuna. "Organic excavation, got it. You just need a big ol' hole for your training." He pulled out a ridiculously small calculator and jabbed at the keys. "That much dirt removal, shoring, hauling, and temporary security fencing, no questions asked. That's going to run you $45,000, cash up front for Phase 1. I winced. That was my entire savings account for a new roof, but roofs don't send a message to Bartholomew. "Deal," I said, without blinking. Gus nodded, suddenly seeming much more interested. "You called the city?" "I asked for a shed permit. They said no. This is not a shed. This is anti-shed. Therefore, it is exempt from their regulations, probably." Gus chuckled, a sound like ball bearings tumbling down a dry pipe. "Good enough for me. We start Monday." Monday was chaos. The noise alone must have melted Mrs. Henderson's prize azaleas. A massive excavator, a truly beautiful, menacing piece of yellow machinery, appeared in my backyard like an angry mechanical god. The ground trembled. The dirt began to fly, forming what I affectionately called Mount Mitch, a colossal mound of dark, nutrient-rich earth piled along the edge of my driveway. Every time I drove past it, I felt a surge of defiant pride. The next contractor I needed was Frank, the concrete man. Gus had done his job. I had a gigantic, gaping hole in my yard. Now I needed structure. Frank's company was called Ironclad Concrete. Frank was the opposite of Gus, tidy, meticulous, and extremely skeptical. He wore a crisp polo shirt and carried a laser level. "So, Mr. Mitch," Frank began, holding his clipboard like a shield, "you need a monolithic concrete pour for a subsurface structure. Why the thickness?" He was referring to my insistence on 18-inch reinforced walls. "Nuclear fallout," I said simply. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Is this area prone to nuclear fallout?" "Well, the Pizza Hut is right there. Who knows what they're doing with those ovens?" I deadpanned. "Look, Frank, I need it soundproof and blast-resistant. Think of it as a secure media archiving facility." Frank sighed. It's a basement, son. A seriously over-engineered basement. He tapped his pen on the clipboard. But I follow the specs. You want a fortress? I'll build you a fortress. It'll cost you, and your energy bills will be astronomical keeping it ventilated. I didn't care. I was $100,000 deep into the pit, literally and financially. This was about principle. This was about winning. The concrete phase was even louder than the digging. The giant mixer trucks lined up outside, blocking half the street. Mrs. Henderson was taking photos furiously. I'm pretty sure she hired a drone for surveillance. Then came the near disaster. Around week 6, Gus's crew was boring the hole for the primary air intake shaft when they hit something hard and wet. Gus burst through the makeshift tarp that served as my privacy screen, looking genuinely worried. "Mitch, we got a problem. I think we nicked the primary city water line for the whole block." My heart stopped. Flooding the bunker was one thing, but cutting off the water supply for 100 houses was an act of war, even for Bartholomew. "How bad is it?" I whispered. "Dripping, for now." We stopped. "But the pressure is going to drop on the whole street. Someone's going to notice." This was it. The official call, the city seizure, the inevitable condemnation. I had to think fast. I had to cover my tracks poorly, but quickly. I threw on a high-vis vest I'd bought, ironically. I ran out front, where Mrs. Henderson was already talking to another neighbor. "Everyone!" I yelled, waving my arms like a distressed airport marshal. "The city is doing a surprise infrastructure inspection. They warned us about minor pressure fluctuations. This is totally normal. Go about your day." It was a ridiculous, spur-of-the-moment lie, but people hate the city more than they hate me. They all just grumbled and went back inside. Gus fixed the line that night for an extra $5,000 in untraceable currency. The stakes had been raised. I was now actively involved in covert infrastructure manipulation. The temporary reprieve couldn't last forever. My personal disaster preparedness training facility was now a gaping hole, with massive concrete walls poured, cured, and ready for the roof. It looked less like a hole and more like the empty tomb of a very wealthy, very paranoid giant. I knew the call would come, but I wasn't expecting the theatricality of it. One Tuesday afternoon, I found a sign planted right next to my mailbox. It wasn't a cheerful yard sign. It was a massive, laminated notice, glaring red and white, proclaiming, "Notice of unpermitted subsurface construction and violation of zoning ordinance 302.4. Stop work immediately." It was signed by, who else? Bartholomew P. Higgins III, Director of Code Enforcement. I immediately went outside and tried to flip the sign over. It was bolted into the ground. I grabbed a can of spray paint and, in a moment of true inspiration, added a hand-painted caption directly beneath the red text. "Welcome to the future site of the MPDPTF. Inquire within for tours." I successfully turned a notice of violation into an advertisement. The next day, the cavalry arrived. It wasn't just Bartholomew. It was a whole motorcade. I counted 2 black and white police cruisers, 1 city-issue white sedan, and a Ford Explorer with a big code enforcement magnet stuck to the side. The Jesuits, police came first. Officer Ramirez, a young guy with a very polished uniform, approached my front door. "Mr. Mitch," he asked, trying to sound imposing. "That's me. Can I help you, officer? Is this about my lawnmower?" "No, sir. This is about the structure." He gestured vaguely toward my backyard, where Gus's crew was still secretly hauling material out of the service entrance. "We've received multiple complaints, and the city has issued a stop work order." I am aware of the stop work order, officer. I'm afraid I can't comply. Ramirez's eyes widened. Sir, that's not optional. You have to cease construction immediately. I understand the law, officer, I said calmly. But the fact is, the construction has ceased. This is now the interior finishing phase. That falls under interior decorating, which, last time I checked, doesn't require a permit from Bartholomew. We're installing the throw pillows. Just then, Inspector Davis, a severe woman in an ill-fitting blazer, stepped forward, flanked by Bartholomew himself, who looked like a man who hadn't had a proper vowel movement in decades. Mr. Mitch, this is not a joke, Davis said, holding up a clipboard with a laminated copy of the violation notice. You excavated a multi-level structure without the required permits. This is a severe violation, and we are ordering immediate access to assess the structural integrity and determine remediation. Access denied, I replied, standing my ground on my doormat. This structure, as you call it, is my private property, and more importantly, a highly sensitive, secure facility. I cannot, in good conscience, expose my preparations to unvetted individuals. Bartholomew P. Higgins III finally spoke, his voice thin and reedy. This is retaliation, Mr. Mitch. You were denied a permit for a shed, and now you have created this subterranean monstrosity. A monstrosity? I threw my hands up dramatically. Sir, I asked for a 120-square-foot shed. You told me it was an aesthetic affront. I merely shifted my entire utility footprint 25 feet beneath the grass. How can something you cannot see possibly violate the historical sight lines? Davis was losing patience. We are going to obtain a warrant, Mr. Mitch. You do that, I said, leaning in conspiratorially. But before you do, may I suggest you consult Ordinance 40B, subsection C, exemptions for non-habitational subsurface storage. They all froze. I had spent a sleepless night researching the most obscure, ridiculous local laws. The loophole was glorious. The original shed was denied because it was a structure intended for storage. The bunker, however, once I slightly modified the definition and paid a cheap lawyer named Vinny to file some paperwork, could be classified as a non-residential subsurface storage unit, and more importantly, a seasonal root cellar. The code stated that any structure dedicated to the storage of food or seasonal goods, and not intended for permanent human habitation, required only an excavation permit, and the subsequent fine for lack of one, and not a full building permit, provided its ceiling height was below a certain threshold. The next day, Vinny, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big, calmly explained the situation to a furious Inspector Davis. I paid a massive $20,000 fine for the lack of a proper excavation permit, which, honestly, was a bargain for a 2-story bunker. But the key was, I only paid the fine. The city, faced with the legal precedent of a legally defined 2,000 square foot root cellar and the potential for a very embarrassing public lawsuit about bureaucratic overreach, had to back down. They couldn't condemn it. They couldn't order it filled in. They had to grudgingly let me keep my beautiful, ridiculous subterranean masterpiece. With the legal battle won, or at least temporarily stalemated, it was time for the fun part. The interior. Frank's team had installed the secondary ventilation, the spiral staircase, and the heavy steel vault door disguised beneath a patch of meticulously cut sod. I decided to lean into the absurdity. The upper level was the command center, a wall-to-wall 1980s video arcade complete with a neon sign that read, Mitch's Secure Media Archiving Facility. The lower level was the true luxury zone. A movie theater, a minibar, and a ridiculously spacious room dedicated solely to storage, which, yes, contained a single rake. I was victorious, but I needed the world, specifically Mrs. Henderson and Bartholomew, to know it. I decided to throw a party. Not just any party, a bunker warming party. The invitation, delivered to every house in the neighborhood, was simple. Come celebrate the grand opening of the MPDPTF, proof that spite can be structural. BYOB. Bring your own trowel. The night of the party was fantastic. I had a line of bewildered neighbors filing down the spiral stairs, their faces moving from confusion to shock to grudging admiration. The contrast was hilarious. You step through a hidden hatch in a perfectly manicured lawn and are instantly transported to a concrete-lined, neon-lit shrine to petty revenge. "Mitch," stammered Gary from across the street, holding a lukewarm beer. "This is incredible. What is all this for?" "Preparation, Gary. Just preparation. Say, did you know that the structural integrity of this bar top is rated for a magnitude 7.0 seismic event? Try spilling a drink on that." Then Mrs. Henderson arrived. I knew she couldn't resist. She was wearing a dress, but her eyes held the cold, calculating intent of an auditor. She took a glass of punch and surveyed the arcade room with an air of profound disapproval. "Mitch, this is utterly irresponsible," she sniffed, dodging a teenager playing Pac-Man. "And I highly doubt the structural integrity of this storage unit is up to code." "Eleanor, my dear," I said, slinging an arm around her shoulder. "Did you know that according to Ordinance 40B, subsection C, all seasonal root cellars must maintain a festive atmosphere? The video games are technically humidity control units." The night hit its climax around 10:30 p.m. Everyone was having a great time. The music was loud, because soundproofing, and my bunker was packed. The only weak link, the one thing I hadn't perfectly engineered, was the ventilation system. The primary air intake, the one that Gus had almost messed up, got partially clogged with a rogue tree branch that blew in during the day. Suddenly, a loud, high-pitched whine echoed through the lower level. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the bunker into near-total darkness, save for the emergency battery-powered lanterns. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Someone screamed, "It's happening! The bombs!" "Everyone stay calm," I yelled, trying to sound authoritative while simultaneously tripping over a bag of chips. "It's just the auxiliary ventilation. We have 2 hours of independent oxygen supply. Don't panic." Of course, they panicked. The party instantly devolved into a chaotic surge towards the spiral staircase. People were scrambling, convinced the outside world had ended. This was the ultimate, unintentional comedic payoff. The Doomsday bunker was causing the very panic it was designed to survive. Just as the first wave of terrified neighbors reached the top hatch, the heavy steel door flew open, letting in a flood of natural, non-apocalyptic evening air. Standing there were Officer Ramirez and Officer Thompson, flashlights in hand, looking utterly perplexed. "Mr. Mitch, we received a noise complaint and reports of an explosion," Ramirez shouted over the din of retreating partygoers. I casually stepped past a hysterical Gary. "Officer, relax. No explosion. Just a momentary lapse in atmospheric circulation. We were having a secure facility social demonstration." Ramirez shined his light around the arcade. He looked at the Galaga machine, then at the steel-lined 18-inch thick walls, and then back at me. He just shook his head. "I don't even know what I'm looking at, sir." "It's a legally defined root cellar, officer. Would you like a tour?" I'm having a special on Ms. Pac-Man high scores." They left soon after, unwilling to deal with the mountain of bureaucracy that would accompany investigating a party in a legally designated root cellar. I had won. The city, embarrassed by the bad press and the structural impossibility of shutting me down, grudgingly let me keep my bunker, sealed with a massive, one-time fine and a mountain of legal paperwork that defined it as a seasonal storage unit, not a habitable space. The party debris was cleaned up the next day, and the Great Root Cellar War was officially over. I was poorer, definitely more paranoid, and the proud owner of an asset that was likely impossible to sell without causing a real estate meltdown. The best part of the whole ordeal? The irony. I spent all that money, endured all that stress, and battled the entire zoning board to create a highly secure, blast-proof, 2-story subterranean fortress. And what did I actually use it for? Mostly it became the perfect place to watch movies without my wife complaining about the volume. And occasionally, when I really needed to concentrate on a video game, it was my perfectly isolated office. The soundproofing was incredible. I could have a full marching band down there, and Mrs. Henderson wouldn't hear a peep. She still sends me accusatory emails, of course, but now they are just proof that I drove her crazy. The biggest, most embarrassing irony of all involved the very thing that started the whole mess, the shed. Remember my lawnmower and the rakes? The ones that needed the 120-square-foot shed? Well, the 2,000-square-foot bunker was built. It had a dedicated storage room that was easily the size of a small apartment. It was humidity-controlled, temperature-regulated, and built to withstand a small asteroid. I walked down the spiral stairs one afternoon, grabbed a cold soda, and walked into the massive storage area. I had built a perfect reinforced multi-story structure for all my stuff. And there, sitting in the middle of the empty, pristine concrete floor, was one solitary rake. I had completely forgotten to move the lawnmower. It was still sitting outside, under a plastic tarp that was perpetually damp, right where the original, unapproved shed was supposed to go. I had built a mansion underground, a monument to defiance and sheer human stubbornness, and my lawnmower was still outside in the rain. I just couldn't bring myself to move it. It felt right. It felt like the perfect final joke on Bartholomew P. Higgins III and his precious historical sightlines. He denied me the shed, and in doing so, he forced me to dig an absurd, glorious, and completely unneeded root cellar that was 10 times too big. I looked at the lone rake, then at the vast, echoing concrete room. I smiled, a genuine, non-sarcastic smile this time. Justice wasn't a shed. Justice was having a place to store one rake that was bigger than your neighbor's living room. I sat down on a folding chair and addressed the imaginary reader, because that's what a guy who built a bunker in his backyard does. See? Sometimes you just gotta dig deep to prove a point. They wanted me to conform. I non-conformed so hard I ended up in the Earth's basement. Next time I'm trying for a submarine. I hear the water board is much more chill than the zoning board.